Hello, hello. Can you hear me? Jamie, can you hear me? Just getting set up. Okie dokie. Let's see if we get the audio sorted.
How about now? I think I was muted.
Yeah, I can hear you now. Perfect. Welcome. I'm just gonna quickly announce that we're live on Twitter and we're good to go. But thank you for doing that. This is really cool.
Oh, thank
you. How are you today? Is it a holiday where you are?
I believe so. Yes.
Yes.
Well, no, because my sister's in school today, but so no, probably not. It is cold though with the cold front that's been coming down.
Yeah, you're in Texas, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I heard you guys got snow, which is not very often, right, that you get snow?
Yeah, not very often. A couple of years ago we had it. It wasn't really snowing where we were because we're quite south.
Yeah.
Should I share the camera as well?
Sorry, what's that? No, you don't need the camera. Only if you want. If you're going to share anything, you can just do screen shares instead of the camera, whatever you like. It's a podcast, so all of these episodes are going to be podcast audio only format. So, all right, let's tweet that out. See who joins us. Maybe people will have some questions near the end and all that. And let's do that right now. Tweet. All right. Okay, wrong Twitter account. I have like 4. Let's see. Okay.
I can hear the mechanical keyboard you were talking about.
Yeah, it's pretty loud. It's not a very quiet keyboard. I have a quieter one that I put on top of my laptop. I like mechanical keyboards. There's a slightly quieter one, but has a very good feel to it. I think it's the Leopold mechanical keyboard. It's really good. And let's see if we have this. I think this is the proper URL for YouTube. So you might want to check. Watch live on YouTube here. Answering questions. Okay, in chat. There are the Zoom call. Okie dokie. Hopefully that works. Okay, so I'm just gonna get my phone to be the thing that looks at YouTube live and see if I can get chats going here. Let's see. Actually, you know what? It's displayed here. So I'm gonna mute it, move it forward, and oops, that's not right. Where's the chat? There it is. We're live. Okay, great. Yeah, so welcome, Jamie. This is a really awesome episode because it, like we were chatting earlier on Twitter, this brings me back to my days of learning programming at a young age. You're only 18, so that's the awesome thing, is that you've done so much and didn't waste any time to learn so much about programming. I guess we were chatting just that things were a little bit different. I'm much older by now, unfortunately. And back in the day, before the internet, I know many people don't realize there were such days as no internet. Learning to program from books was a lot harder. So to me, it's really a learning opportunity just to see, how your world is different than mine, because I suffer the benefits and downsides of my experiences. I have certain things that I associate with learning formally, informally, whereas you've only had a really very approachable way of working. So I mean, that has a lot of benefits, obviously, but it also has some drawbacks where I think most people at your age maybe take it for granted and don't take advantage of all of the things available to them. So maybe tell me how you got interested in programming. At what age, and did you steal your dad's computer? What happened?
Well, I first started when I was 12, and that was with C++ at the time. And it
Oh,
was because I had these big plans to build a home automation system and a home monitoring system. And so I basically was interested in trying to collect as much information about the environment as possible through various sensors and then perform analysis and visualization on that data. And the big first plan I wanted to do was to put CCTV cameras in different rooms of the houses of my house, and then start to have OpenCV computer vision
right.
algorithms running on that, and then start to perform an analysis on those video feeds, detect anomalies, or detect if someone's holding a weapon or a firearm, then that could be cause for concern, or do things like facial recognition to see if someone is in the house who shouldn't be, and so on. And so I ended up starting with C++ just because I figured C++ was the best language to use for those kinds of tasks. People talk about Python and how that's great
Hmm.
for those kinds of things, but at the time I was looking at it and everything was pointing to C++ due to the fact that Python is kind of slow. Executing the runtime of Python is slow as compared to C++, where you get that low level memory control. So that took me to C++, and it kind of just went from there.
Yeah, that's kind of how a lot of I guess I have the same parallel. I wanted to back then I didn't have cameras that I could install, but we're trying to relate it for some people that might have grown up in the 80s like myself. It was that technology choice was also a key part of choosing a language. For me, it was moving from Commodore 64 Basic to assembler because basic wouldn't do for video game programming. It was just too slow. It's the interpreted
Mm,
instructions, and so you had to go to assembler to actually write something that would be performant. And you start out slowly with some experiments to see how quickly the system performs, what you're capable of. Did you have any kind of that experimentation in C++, just seeing what the limits were to what you were able to accomplish at such a young age, especially when you're young? It's not very, there's very little guidance that you get. I mean, these days, as I said, you can
mhm.
find, channels on YouTube and articles, so it's a little bit easier. But still, as a young person, even learning how to learn, you're still learning that part. So,
Yeah,
how did you find any limitations on your initial projects? I never finished my first video game that I wanted, by the way, so don't feel bad.
yeah. Well, I didn't really, because I think half the time at that point I still didn't really know what I was doing. Um,
Hmm.
Especially with C++, like I can remember pointers and references and memory addresses and all of that, and it was um a lot. It was important. The concepts themselves were important, but they weren't directly related to the act of getting the job done. But they were
Right.
important in and of themselves if you want to get the job done in a performing manner. Um, but I didn't really encounter limitations because I ended up moving to C sharp um, after starting C++ and then just kind of abandoning that project idea, because I was never really dead set on doing one thing. I was always just happy to stay with something for so long, get to a certain level of proficiency with that, and then move on to something else. I'm not that way now, because now I care about getting a specific job done, and you can't just switch to any technology you want. But back then, when it was just free learning, I would just move however I wanted. So I didn't find myself encountering many or doing like performance tests with C++ or anything at that
Yeah,
point.
there's you tweeted quite a bit about now you're just for people that are listening, you're tweeting actively the 100 days of code. I think it's kind of a popular thing amongst people new to the industry and people young people learning. So said on Twitter, you can follow that hashtag and really find interesting approachable lessons from from people that are in the same kind of area of just starting. And one of the things that you tweeted there was very true about language preference, and I think this starts to talk about that, where you realize that C++ wasn't necessarily the language that was going to be the best for that purpose, and that you could still get the performance that you needed out of C sharp. And of course, if anyone is interested, C sharp has all of these different, if you're doing advanced things in the C sharp, there's ways you can direct the garbage processor, the collector, to be turned off, and memory pinning, and all of these things are available. And then as you go deeper, you can start to see the intermediate language, which is the thing that drives the .NET framework, and that whole ecosystem underneath, where you can be a little bit closer to the metal, and start to maybe even inject some assembler if you need somewhere. But personally, I've never needed that. So likewise with Go and Rust, there's different advantages to all of these. But it's nice to see that to me, that happened, that leap from the Commodore 64 assembler. I also did some assembler on the Amiga series, on the Motorola chipsets. But after college, around your age, I did start to look at C++ as well, because we had to learn that at some point, and C, and basically understand that the compilers were doing the best job to interpret what I was expressing through something more understandable to something that's still performant, right?
Mm-hmm.
So anything you can tell us about that journey through 100 days of code, and some of the long, you have a very long thread on Twitter, I think, in your
Yeah.
100 days. What's
Well,
that thread about?
I haven't done 100 days of code myself. The reason I put the hashtags in there was just because for exposure of the tweets themselves to that group.
Right.
Because I was, after I've been, learning all this over the last few years, I've started to notice that, especially in the community where 100 days of code is popular, which is the JavaScript community, you see
That's
it a
right.
lot there. I've come to notice that JavaScript developers don't always have the same exposure to best practices and to patterns and things in the same manner that .NET or Java developers and so on do. If you think about C sharp, after you start learning basics of C sharp and doing, servers and things, you start getting dependency injection pushed at you, patterns of enterprise application architecture pushed at you, appropriate abstraction repositories and all of that. Whereas in JavaScript, the new developers to JavaScript don't have any of that, because the push there seems to be just use MongoDB and just use something like Mongoose and put all your business logic on your models, which are attached to the database because it's active record anyway, which is all just, not the best in terms of cleanliness with patterns. And so I didn't do 100 days of code myself, but I attached tweet there, the hashtag there, because I wanted to try to get the JavaScript developers who are new and who may be following it be exposed to some of the things I was saying, because I think that can help them in terms of not getting stuck into that JavaScript land and that JavaScript way of doing things.
Yeah, it's definitely a free for all. Sometimes it feels like, and I don't think its popularity is kind of helping it as well, because there's so many different frameworks that pop up on top, especially since it's driven a lot by learning things to the front end, and being such a loose language with very few guides. It may not, like you said, be the best set of best language for a set of patterns to start to use to organize your work. Now, that being said, obviously, once someone does learn ways to keep their code organized, it really doesn't matter after that if they go back to JavaScript or apply the same principles to
Yeah,
JavaScript, which is
absolutely.
what you made. But it's an interesting observation about the 100 days of code, that it's really mostly JavaScript, simply because it's in every browser, I guess. So it's very accessible. Anyone, can open up the dev panel in their browser and start to write code immediately. And everyone's got a browser everywhere, even phones these days. I'm sure there's going to be some sort of a console in a browser on a phone one of these days. That's approachable. But for sure, any laptop out there is going to have that ability for people to dive in. So you have a, like you said, of an entire uh, world just spamming that topic. So now you made another interesting comment between criticisms of static languages versus dynamic languages, and this goes back to JavaScript versus C# and TypeScript on top of JavaScript. Did you use TypeScript yourself? I guess you're trying. You tweet a lot, so I'm trying to catch up on all the things that I read from you over the last few months.
Yes, so whenever I work with JavaScript, it's never JavaScript, it's always TypeScript. And I've been using TypeScript for the last 2.5 years or so now.
Now, for someone that's familiar with JavaScript, as most people are, what can they expect in terms of benefits for looking at TypeScript instead? And then, is there anything that they learned in JavaScript that'll help them in their TypeScript, or is it an entirely brand new thing for them?
No, it's basically TypeScript is JavaScript. It's just TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript. So TypeScript only exists at design time, at compile time, and it gives you the ability to add rigid types to the JavaScript programming language. But the main thing people should realize is that TypeScript goes away at runtime. It only exists during design time. And so with that, people say, oh, you compile it and you see errors and that's bad. And, I try to point out, well, no, it's a good thing, because if you're getting errors in the compilation of TypeScript, then that's just solved you potential runtime errors you would have got when executing the JavaScript. And I would almost always prefer to be told by a compiler that there's a failure, rather than have to trace that through debugging at runtime. But TypeScript adds static typing, and it does away with many of the trivial problems you would sometimes see with JavaScript. It makes some things a lot more organized. It forces you to abide by API contracts and things like that, gives you better IntelliSense and so on. And just because that TypeScript gives you those types, it makes it a lot more easier to implement design patterns in a more traditional manner inside of JavaScript, rather than having to, it's a completely different environment. If you think of an adapter pattern, for instance, the way you expect to do that is to define some generic adapter interface and then expect that you have the concrete implementations abiding by that, and you can inject those in. With JavaScript, it's more of a free-for-all, because you're not in any way contractually obligated to abide by that interface, whereas with TypeScript, when you define the interface and the types that way, it does. And so it allows you to have an easier time writing the code, an easier time structuring it, and then just it allows you to implement those design patterns more traditionally. And I couldn't imagine working with anything JavaScript related without TypeScript anymore. Even the simplest of things, it's TypeScript for me.
Yeah, what's really what surprised me when you said that is that is an incredible insight at such a young age. But I also noticed that you have the advantage of not having been influenced by the Ruby on Rails uprising of 11 years ago, etc., that I've been subjected to and others have been subjected to. So what you're talking about makes absolute sense. Why wouldn't you want a shorter feedback loop to know that you've written something that's just not going to work? Why would you now defer to a set of tests and still, TDD and all of those types of talks? You're certainly familiar with my criticisms of that. And so these subjective practices, you almost need to be an expert in them to just bring that same level of checking correctness that you get out of a quote unquote compiler or statically typed interpreter. And so, this is a lesson for people that have been in the industry for many years, like myself, that, learning from you is key, because, I've said it over and over again, a lot of people have learned too much to learn anything new. And so maybe just not being subjected to this long history going down rabbit holes of trying to search for something better. A lot of the industry got stuck in a certain dogmatic way of thinking, and some ultimatums that said you're either with us or you're against us, like the dynamic languages versus the static type languages. And I think a lot of the arguments from the dynamic camp side say that, well, you're just not a, you're not a good enough developer. That's why you're having these problems that you didn't have when you're using a static language. It's nice to see that argument come from someone that's really, started programming recently and looked at, and recently for me is, the last 6 years. So that's all of your programming experience. And so it's really good to see the carte blanche type of perspective that someone's come in, as looked at the industry as is at this moment, evaluated what we have right now, and applied themselves since a very young age to make real projects and share with everyone what that experience is like. So very nice of you to do that.
Thank you.
So what's let's switch subjects now. What are your goals for your career? And you've done a lot, at a young age. For me, going around with a physical resume into offices is definitely not something you have to do. You can apply online. Back in my day, it's even before email when I was starting. So it meant out printing out 100 resumes and then putting on your best suit you could afford and walking into a bunch of offices and meeting people in person. So in terms of career and what your aspirations are, is what's still driving? Is it still the home automation, or have you moved on to other things? And what do you want to do in the next chapter of your career?
Yeah, I've certainly moved on from that original endeavor, but I'm entirely driven now with an entrepreneurial mindset. So my plan is to found a bunch of startups this year in a variety of different markets. Business intelligence is one, data visualization is another, building a low code or no code tool is another one, which is why I've been mentioning WebAssembly and Rust recently, because I'm going to need WebAssembly for that startup. But yeah, everything now is just driven at the notion of founding companies, and hopefully a monopoly at some point. I've got these big ideas for space exploration and innovating the transportation sector, but I can't go build a space shuttle right now. So my focus is more on SaaS, launching SaaS software, because that would allow me to hopefully exit my acquisition down the line, make a lump sum of money, and then use that to reinvest into more physical ventures, in terms of like starting companies that can do that kind of work rather
Oh,
than just being software.
that's great to hear, because again, back in my day with the whole VC side, the funding a company, it wasn't as accessible. Now we have things like Y Combinator and other
Hmm.
accelerators and incubators, founders, sharing what's worked, what hasn't, and I've had to wait a long time for the industry to catch up to be able to help software companies in the same way that other companies could get started, with loans or whatever else you needed to do back in the day, more traditional things. So now you have way more, to at your disposal. For example, I remember even, gosh, was it 25 years ago, something like that, maybe 23 years ago, but quite a while ago, trying to, I was big into automated trading systems, financial data coming in and having reactive systems to that. You required, if my startup required a $10 million investment, because you needed to be a bank status to start. So you're seeing this leap that you need to make, and you're making the right steps so that you can get, have an acquisition, an exit, and then you can reinvest and repurpose what you're doing into the next bigger thing that's going to be ultimately your goal. So
Hmm.
have you started to look at some startups or have you began to work with them or start them yourself? And are you doing anything for a day job in terms of programming? How does it all fit?
Okay, well, so the first like first company idea I was trying to create, which I didn't end up going through with. That was 2 years ago. So I would have been, I think, 16 at that point.
Yeah.
So that was a that was an e-commerce application. It was based around the idea of bartering, trying to send. It was basically trying to create a marketplace where you have the ability to purchase things without actually paying money for it, instead paying only the cost of shipping. And the way that would work is by having a currency that only existed for inside the marketplace, and it was basically bartering. And so I was building that in with Node.js at the time, and that was when, as we were talking about these things with like as far as patterns and as far as seeing the JavaScript way of doing things and how there may be better ways of doing said things, that was where that insight started to come, because I remember first building that and I was writing unit tests, and I didn't know better at this point, but I was writing unit tests the quote unquote JavaScript way, or the way you see everyone doing it. And that led to the tests being extremely coupled to the implementation, and then you couldn't refactor without having all those tests break. And so that was like when the alarm bells started to go off, and I thought, hey, there's another world out here of doing things that I'm not being exposed to when I'm sticking with thinking about JavaScript. And so that then led me looking at all of the patterns you hear about with .NET and Java, and then coming back and trying to apply those into TypeScript, not mocking, for instance, or state-based assertions as opposed to interaction-based ones. And so that was what started to give me those new methodologies of writing software. And then from there, I kind of stopped working on startups just to focus on learning as much as possible. And then, enterprise patterns, DDD, CQRS, event sourcing, and so on. It was first when I started to hear about those. And then now I'm working on three startup ideas. One is in the business intelligence niche. One is in data visualization, being able to allow stakeholders in businesses to easily create dashboards without having a technical background. If you think about tools like Grafana, they allow you to make dashboards, but there's still a query language behind there, and you still have to be somewhat technical to be able to work with them. So I want to try to ease the pain of data visualization. And then I'm also working on something in the education technology sector, something to beep the whole site, basically.
Well, that's great. It's interesting that you're already getting onto startups that are answering questions for things that I want. I mean, certainly with the event modeling side, the visualization part, there is a couple of companies working on products there. So that's a huge market, because that bridge between the technical and non-technical is really what we need
Mm-hmm.
so desperately from a lot. So it's really nice to see that already now you're seeing that need. But you mentioned event sourcing and CQRS. What kind of got you into that? I mean, I was in my 30s, but before I had the privilege of learning those approaches. How did you come across CQRS and event sourcing?
Well, I think I ended up getting rather lucky. So as was working with JavaScript, and I started using dependency injection for the first time. There was a library for dependency injection for JavaScript called Linux, and I ended up meeting um, the developer of that open source tool, and we spoke for some time, and then he ended up mentioning those enterprise patterns, DDD, CQS, event sourcing, and so on, and that kind of opened the door for me to learn all of those things. So if I don't like thinking about randomness or chance. I like to think that we have complete control on everything and over everything, and you can take a series of deterministic steps to get where you are in life. But looking back on that, that was a chance meeting almost, that I learned about that from this individual. And if that hadn't happened, I don't know if I would even be aware of those patterns today, because I hadn't heard of them. So that was what opened the door there.
Interesting. So it sounds like hearing about starting to look at the problems of JavaScript and looking at dependency injection and different patterns to help out of some of the messiness of the code. You ended up getting into CQRS and event sourcing and associated practices. And then from that, that gave you more confidence that these patterns were something that could help you basically move in a predictable manner forward with your solutions. Is that right?
Yes, and then I was also saying I ended up getting into those. I only learned about those patterns by chance because I met the developer of an open source tool, and he mentioned those patterns to me, and that's how I first learned about those. But yes, as far as application wise, I can't imagine building an application without TQRS. No, even like no matter how simple it is, because not going all the way in terms of having different data stores and trying to synchronize the two of them, but just the notion of having separate view models or read models from then you do write models and separating them out like that just makes complete sense even for simple applications to me, because it gives you that power to go straight to SQL to query DTOs and view models specifically for the needs of the client, without, if you're using some like repository pattern to abstract the database away. CQRS allows you to not end up having 30 different methods in your repository for different types of queries. And it allows you to build a domain model and a right side model that solves the problem for the right side and isn't being hampered by querying requirements.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize how much complexity they are throwing in if they mix the reads and writes together. If you just separate the write part, then you've got such a smaller scope to get right. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
However, if they're all muddled together, it seems like you're trying to spin so many plates in the air at once, and it just kind of crumbles. Soon you can't keep up with it. And I think it goes back to testing as you get a proliferation of integration tests, or at least the need for integration tests, as with a single model where the reads and the write models are intertwined. You have so much data coupled at all times for anything you want to test. So I'm guessing you're starting to see the benefits of just having a um, well structured code, so that you're not swimming through endless edge cases that and coupling that you didn't see as your solution went from the initial day of development to a month or two, and start tripping over your own code.
Yeah, definitely. And the same with testing too. Like those testing patterns are extremely critical because, a lot of people do look down on tests and say that testing is too hard or the tests don't provide any value to them. And I think that all has to come back to the fact that you probably aren't testing as well as you could be or as well as you should be. If you're bringing in a mocking framework and you're mocking everything, then no, those tests are not giving you any value because they're not hitting your actual code. And the
Yeah,
big change for me was because I do always test it that way, but I also heard Ian Cooper's talk. I don't know if you've seen it, the TDD, where it all went wrong. And
yeah.
he mentions in that
Ian's a
talk,
great guy. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
well, he mentions in that talk the unit of isolation is the test, and that the unit of functionality is the test itself, not the system on the test.
Yeah,
And that completely, I think I put those words up on the wall at one point because that changed everything as far as writing tests. Because now you don't need to mark every dependency if that dependency is deterministic, or you can also instead inject some handcrafted fake into the system on the test and then do state-based assertions on that, rather than bringing in some over-the-top mocking and stubbing library, which in and of itself just serves to obfuscate, because I believe that the test should be expressive and that they should tell a story of the given scenario that's being tested. And if you start bringing in all these mocking frameworks, they obfuscate that, and the story isn't as expressive per se that the test is showing.
exactly. It's interesting when we also had Jeremy Chessing that was on the podcast and the meetup before, and he's taken that to the next level with functional only F sharp, distilling that down, and that being deterministic is really the key. Maybe it's something that is it sounds too limiting when someone's starting out and they just want to throw any piece of code as they're starting out, and because they get a great sense of accomplishment. And so only later does a person realize that the structure is actually something that's going to help them. And maybe it's because people slowly have to move out of the trivial example code when they're starting out, and they need to feel the need for that level of organization. Otherwise, they may feel limited by it, and they're not able to use things as they see fit for their current learning journey, I guess. I don't know.
Hmm.
Maybe you come to that conclusion a different way, but I certainly see people thinking that they can take a boot camp course in a month or two, get a job and just start working right away without putting in the time to experience the negative aspects of the freedom that you have of being able to write any line of code you want.
Definitely. I think, and as well, once I started to learn those patterns, I started to become untrusting of learning material, which was interesting because all this time, whatever article I read or book I read or whatever, I heard an instructor on Udemy or whatever say, I would just take that and apply it. But after starting to see some of this, I started to become untrusting of the learning material and thinking to myself, well, are they really showing the best way here? Or is this really a best practice or a standard? And so that questioning, I think, is quite important, because if you're a new developer to JavaScript and you're reading Medium articles, pretty much every single thing is going to tell you the same concept: MongoDB, Mongoose, Active Record, put all your business logic on the module, and that module owns your database schema, and so on. And those are not great practices. It's fine if you just want to teach someone how to build an API with this persistent storage to it, but it's not for proper software. And that was one of the things that kind of displayed itself to me when I was trying to build that original e-commerce idea. I thought, well, this isn't working. There has to be a better way. And when I found out that indeed there was, that made me start to become untrusting of learning content to some extent. And then I also think the danger people can fall into is when they find out that there's a lot more to do, there's a lot more either to learn and to implement, then you can fall into the trap of using frameworks for that. For instance, there's a very popular framework in the Node community at the moment called Nest, and it pushes 3-layer architecture, and it has repositories and things like that as first class um, concepts. But then you just look at that and I think, well, you don't need a framework for that. You don't need to use something like Nest.js to give you a repository. You can make a repository yourself, and you're better for it because then there's no magic involved. Or they're opinionated on the ORM they use, which I don't think is a great ORM. They're opinionated on using decorators and annotations everywhere, which I don't particularly agree with,
Mm-hmm.
and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I've gone through that myself of aspect-oriented programming and other things. Even in the enterprise space, these best practices, quote unquote, or flavors of the recent 2 years. That's something to be very aware of. And you're very lucky that by the time of you're 18 and you've learned that lesson a lot sooner. That's going to make for way easier next few years for you. So I mean, it's very frustrating for me as well, because I've been doing event sourcing for a long time, and looking at the misconceptions around better practices, because something else is more popular, without really understanding the consequences of that. Definitely, you're touching on some really important deep subjects here, such as libraries versus frameworks. What your trade-offs are when you're grabbing a framework, how heavy a framework is, not just for the amount of code that's running, but also for the concepts that are forced upon you. So if a framework is giving you some benefit for one or two of your needs, most people don't realize that there's the third and fourth and fifth concept, maybe around how it scales, or how it persists, that they're not getting the best pattern for doing that for their solution. So I guess a lot of times you see this choose libraries over frameworks mentality, so that you can pick and choose aspects of a library rather than conform your solution to a framework, which I think is an honest way of looking at the, leveraging previous work in two different ways. I'm not sure if you've found good libraries versus good frameworks already, but if you have, maybe some other people would know what you did to augment what you did to replace Nest, for example.
Well, the replacement to Nest was just to build it from scratch, to not use it all, which I didn't think was that difficult of a task. It seemed like a difficult task at the beginning, but the fact of the matter is, Nest is just pushing three-layer architectures, controllers, services, repositories, and it isn't that difficult to build your own controller, your own service, and your own repository. The difficulty of the repository, I suppose, tends to come into the fact that if you're not doing DDD and you don't have an aggregate pattern in use, then now you could have transactions and units of work on the database that span multiple repositories. So then there does come in a need to build like a unit of work pattern around that, so you can transact with multiple repositories, and then that leads into things like, should a repository have a save method and so on, if you're looking at the modern Founder definition of it as opposed to the DDD definition. But I don't think, what I ended up finding was that in some cases it isn't a terrible idea to reinvent the wheel, in that while reinventing the wheel can have the downside of taking extra time to get a solution to market, it does have the upside of ensuring that you built everything and you understand how it works and there's no magic inside of your code base. And so I would imagine it evens itself out, where there may be a short delay up front if you're building a solution from scratch, but at least now 5, 6, 7 months down the line, you're not going to run into an issue and have a bug in some kind of magic framework code that you don't understand. So,
Yeah,
that
or it gets
time downside
dropped,
works
right?
itself out. Yeah.
Yeah. Because there's a lot of frameworks out there that people loved, and 5, 6 years down the road, they're really not supported anymore, and in fact, they become a treasure trove of security vulnerabilities because they don't update their dependencies and whatnot. And also, I think, at least in the Node.js community and JavaScript framework community, those packages can be quite trivial. I mean, we have the left pad package, right? Which is how do you pad spaces to the left of a string. Honestly, something that should be a one-liner and is a one-liner when you look at the library. It just opens up another vector. And I think recently we've also seen some security breaches when people publish their own packages, malicious packages, under the name that's either identical or similar to a well-known package, and infiltrate larger corporations by injecting code into large corporations, because some, on the off chance that some developer is going to click on the wrong version of that dependency, which is crazy. So there's a lot of reasons to not blindly accept a framework or a library and do it yourself. I think a lot of people do need to just understand what they're getting from a framework by doing the hard work themselves, to see that if I'm going to use a library or a framework, let's attempt to at least write it ourselves and experience the amount of effort that this is replacing. But I think what you're talking about here is people blindly just sitting watching some YouTube videos on how to program, and look at all this stuff that I get for free. They have some trivial solution that's 10 lines of code and it does a lot. Well, that sends the message that the framework is incredibly easy, like incredibly helpful and valuable, but they never go through and show that same project 3 months in, where you're experiencing the opposite from the framework. You're experiencing the limitations. So I don't know if that's what you've done. I mean, you're dealing with some domain-driven design stuff, TQRs, some event sourcing, writing. I wrote my own event store because back in the day there wasn't any event store solutions, and so the concept is simple, right? The idea is you shouldn't need to get a library. But then when you do, it should be something that's giving you the level of functionality that you yourself would, take years to write.
Hmm.
So yeah.
Yeah,
um,
I mean, I haven't done event sourcing quite yet, but DDD and CQRS has kind of been the focus, and then I'll get to event sourcing soon. But as far as like libraries and frameworks, just for DDD alone, and I work with C Sharp now on the back end 90%
mhm.
of the time, not Node anymore. But even with like C Sharp and domain-driven design, you'll find libraries that give you abstract value object base classes and abstract entity and aggregate based
Mhm.
classes, and that just doesn't make any sense to me really, because it's your domain that you own. You should
Yep,
understand all of the code inside of it, and the I can understand like with C sharp and value objects and things, it comes down to how are you going to do equality, because it's a class and it's a reference type, and you want to be able to say it equals based on the values, not based on the fact that it's a different reference in memory. But
that's right.
even then, you can use your own value type base class, and it's not trivial to write. Even JetBrains Writer, if you
Yes.
implement are you creatable, I
That's
think it's
right.
called,
Yeah, that's one of the
it will
first
give you everything.
things. Yeah, it's one of the first things
Yeah.
I did with the DDD and C sharp was that JetBrains auto code generation for those comparators, value by
Hmm.
value, deep comparisons.
Yeah. And then there's records now as well, which are, immutable themselves, and they do that value type
Yeah,
equality. But then some say don't use records for value objects for a few other reasons.
yeah. I have to honestly, it's a recent thing that's come up, and I've been quite interested in it for the promises of for these records will replace for properties and property setters and getters and all the equatable and initialization code that can be quite wordy. So I'm again, I haven't had enough time to play around with the new C sharp features, but certainly if we understand how not to use them, I'm sure they're a great addition, and I'm sure they'll
Hmm.
make the code less verbose and bake some of these things, such important concepts like immutability, into a language. I mean, it already has added a lot of functional paradigms into it. So I mean, I guess that's what are your favorite things about C sharp? It seems like that's your choice. For me, it's definitely was the combination of you know traditional object oriented concepts that I was used to, but also having a pretty good leg into some of the functional patterns that you could start to implement, and things like that. So I don't know. What are your favorite things about C sharp, or someone that's
Well,
starting out? Like if they're coming in from JavaScript, and they probably hear like, oh, that's for stuffy. That C sharp stuff is for stuffy enterprise applications like
mhm.
banks. I don't want to do my cool project in that. I'm going to continue with JavaScript. What would you tell them?
Well, the just like with you, the thing I quite like about jobs about C sharp is that mix of object oriented but also functional. Especially with the functional features that were added because of Link. Um, so yeah, exactly those same reasons. But I think, as you said, that is another stereotype. C sharp is for enterprise, and enterprise equals bad and old and legacy. Um, and I think people don't give it a chance or give it the benefit of the doubt. Like you just need to look at C sharp 9 and see what Microsoft is doing, consolidating everything on the .NET 5, to see that no, this isn't just some enterprise only thing. It's modern and it's useful. And when I look at the technology to use, whether or not I'm proficient in that technology isn't usually what's front and center for me. What's front and center is the community around the technology
Hmm.
and the maturity of both the technology and that community. I care about the maturity of the ecosystem around it, because that's more important to me than do I know how to program in this language or use this tool. I can learn that easily, but if the community around it is terrible, well, then that's not going to help me down the line when
Yeah,
I have
or it just
issues with
doesn't
it.
even exist, right? I mean, it
Mhm.
seems like JavaScript seems to have a brand new community for a brand new framework popping up every year or so. So
Yeah, it
there's
does.
not really, yeah.
And that kind of like led into like with WebAssembly, for instance, you can use C sharp with WebAssembly, but I've decided no, best not to use that, even though I know C#, because of the fact that the community around C# specifically for WebAssembly isn't that high. And from a performance standpoint, the binaries that you get out of that are much larger than what you get with bare bones Rust using WebAssembly. And so that was the push for me to say, well, that's fine. Learning a syntax is not that hard once you've learned syntaxes before. The basic tenets and the basic concepts all apply language agnostically. And so it just made sense to learn a language, because that's going to be more useful for the solution.
Yeah, so maybe let's get into that. How did you find out about Rust, and what, like, is it just the WebAssembly thing that was the motivator for it? What do you like about it? What are the differences for people that are familiar with JavaScript or C Sharp and they were wanting to start to look at Rust? You know, what can you say was your experience switching over to that for that one purpose?
Well, I don't have much experience with Rust at the moment. It was only in the last month or two when I've started looking into it more, because it's for something I plan to do in the future. So I haven't worked with it on a professional project quite yet. But one of the things I quite like about Rust is how much it brings the concept of monads and pattern matching up to the surface. Something I've long said is that error handling should be first class and exception handling should be first class, and exceptions shouldn't be used for control flow. And Rust definitely brings that to the surface in terms of how it has you doing pattern matching quite often to look at any specific errors that have occurred and handle them as first class objects. That's what I like about it, with what I've done so far, but I'm nowhere near proficient at Rust at all. Still got a big book I need to read on it.
Yeah, it's certainly gaining popularity very quickly. Even Linus Torvalds was talking about moving a lot of Linux kernel development from C to Rust, simply because of the controls that you have within that language, and the better ways of expressing that, which is big. I mean, if you want to find someone very conservative about things, Torvalds is probably one of the people in the world that's not going to be accepting any brand new flash in the pan technology by default. So when Linus Torvalds talks about something, it's kind of past some sort of gauntlet of scrutiny from him, based on arguably the largest code base, and which is responsible for it, runs every server in the world these days. So if he's saying something good about Rust, that's a reason alone probably to make sure that you look at it. And yeah, so any other languages that you've had experience with? I know we started off at the beginning, started off with C++ and went into the realities and ended up mostly in C Sharp, and learned some lessons from JavaScript, and now looking at Rust. Anything else you're looking at and considering for your startup projects, and other things that people should be looking at?
Well, the journey I basically went on with programming was, like, as I said, C++ when I was around 12, but then I moved from there to C# and then to Java for Android development. Didn't do much on that front, but it was interesting nonetheless. And then 14, 15 was when I moved toward web development a bit more. So that was, your HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and then PHP. I started to learn around 14, 15, and MySQL for databases, and a bit of work with Unity for game development. But now it's mostly just React, TypeScript for the front end, and C# on the back end. And I'm more interested in not learning new technologies or learning new languages unless it's critically necessary that I use a given technology. And I'm more interested in the theoretical concepts and the theoretical underpinnings that apply to all those languages. One of the things, for instance, I've been focusing on this year more is functional reactive programming, RxJS and RX.NET, or I guess it's on the system.reactive in C# now, but those things, because, like, even as early as, or like a week ago, I was working on something, and I didn't know. Well, so it was a couple months ago, and I had started with needing to to build a solution that would take an audio file and develop a waveform based on the audio file. And I implemented it. And it was a lot of code, but it got the job done. And then a couple months down the line, I started learning RxJS and reactive programming. And I'd heard about it before, but I hadn't done much work with it. And then, after learning about the observables and piping things down, streams down to these operators and doing the transformations on the stream, you realize, oh, I could have done that whole waveform analysis on that audio file in a couple lines of code. I didn't need to load all these buffers into memory and have these 32-bit float arrays that are almost overflowing in terms of memory with the size of the waveform and so on. So the focus for me this year is really enterprise patterns, DDD, CQRS, event sourcing, and so on, microservices, and then functional programming and functional reactive programming.
Well, it sounds to me like you're way ahead of most people out there, and I'm hoping that this is the start that of you helping others, because I think one thing that I wish I had it was things like meetup.com and a better community. I think looking back to starting programming a generation or two, dare I say, ago, is the inaccessibility to that. I was fairly lucky. There was a computer store where I got most of the peripherals and discs, etc., that was kind of close to home. And there was one person that worked there that would make copies off of Usenet. I was a 10-year-old kid or whatever, so I wasn't, first of all, we couldn't afford a modem or anything like that. So it literally, required me to go and I remember getting my first disassembler for my computer on a diskette, because the person in the store saw the potential in me, that I was interested in doing this and I was asking the right questions. So they said, no, here, I'll get this for you, and went in the back and make copies of some code bases that I could then use. And that was my first assembly. Assembly programming was basically on the generosity of someone willing to help out. So I hope that more of that kind of the 100 days of code, etc., can be improved. I know that it's the opposite now. There's lots to learn from, but I think also finding people that are going to help you along is great. And so I hope that you, and because you're younger, you're more relatable, that you also do that for others that are 12 or whatever, or teenagers trying to program their own website or their own video game or whatever home automation project. It's quite neat and affordable too. Like a Raspberry Pi is $5 is the cheapest one. So there's a lot of that, and an initial computer back in my day was a family expense, so it wasn't a trivial thing. So yeah, it's really good to see people in your age, you getting to that level of understanding, where I think a lot of people are still starting right now. I know so many people that have been in the enterprise world with 20 plus years experience, that are just for the first time looking at domain-driven design. They're for the first time looking at CQRS. They're only starting to look at event sourcing. And I think they have a tougher time. You have certainly an advantage of not having some bad habits, as I like to call them. And you already discovered them, and you're young enough to have erased the bad habits, learned the lesson quickly, and actually use the experience to see that you can actually go faster. And I really like that you're saying that as a young person, that it's not harder to start off with these practices, because a lot of times, we get this Rails new is going to give you a whole new web application. You're going to be so much faster. And it's really that initial feeling of productivity, but you're just getting some automation to create some tables for you. That's not really value for the actual logic, right? That's just scaffolding and costs that they're not providing direct value of actual state transitions and all that. So I don't know, what are your feelings about those Ruby on Rails frameworks and things like that? How do you counter that argument?
Well, I mean, I suppose what it comes down to is, why are you learning programming in the first place? Are you just learning it because you want to be able to automate some things, or are you learning it because this is what you care about and you want it to be a career, or you want to treat it as a craft, just like how a craftsman would treat building a chest of drawers? Is that how, in terms of wood, is that how you would want? Is that how you plan to treat software development as an industry and the craft of writing code? And I think that needs to be what dictates the kind of path you go on, because people say, oh, start with Python because Python's easier and you'll have an easier time. But on the same token, if you want to learn and you're 100% dedicated to learning, and you say to yourself, no matter what happens, I'm going to learn XYZ, when at that point the probability of failure almost becomes non-existent, I think,
Hmm.
because it really is a simple mindset. And so when you start to have those feelings, well, we don't need to sugarcoat things anymore if that's how you feel. We don't need to say HTML is a programming language and you know HTML and so you're a programmer. Or we don't need
Hmm.
to say start with Python because it's simple. We can say follow the path that may be less walked and that may be more difficult, but that will build the right knowledge, and will start you off and build the foundation from how computers work, memory and references and pointers, up to those patterns. And so if you care and you're dedicated in that manner, then that should in some respects help you from falling for those frameworks or those things like Ruby on Rails that say will make it so much easier for you. Because you shouldn't really care about making it easier. You should care about having those theoretical underpinnings and truly mastering the craft. And the more abstract you get away from that, and you start expecting that a framework will give it all to you, well, you're doomed from the start, I think.
Yeah, that's a very wise words from someone very young. Don't go for the easy stuff. You'll get led astray. I think that just goes in life in general. And
Mhm.
maybe it's a little bit harder to see through that in tech, but I couldn't have said it better myself. So, yeah. And I guess we're up about an hour. And I think this really covers it. I can't thank you enough for joining the podcast. I think it's going to be one of the uh, most important episodes because this is really something for young people to say, "Hey, I can do this too." But more importantly, I think it's for the people um, that are stuck and not wanting to change with their 20 plus years of experience. Um,
Mhm.
there's the Jamies out there that are gonna just make your life hell because they're willing to learn, and if you're not willing to learn, they are. And so, that's one of the best things about this is really just to show how the next generation. I'm a very optimistic person. I think the next generations are really what are gonna the generations that are gonna fix the world. We're kind of rounding a bend here. I know there's a lot of negativity in the world, but interviews like this, this is what gives me hope for the future. So, thank you, Jamie, for taking the time and sharing all of this. And I can't believe how eloquently you put the concepts out there and the ideas, and most importantly, the attitude one should have when setting out on these journeys. And I think you're going to have a very bright and successful career. When I'm old and no longer relevant, I hope you find a job as a janitor in one of your companies for me.
Oh, well,
So
thank you.
thank you so much. And anyone else wants to come in on the show, and please let me know in Twitter. And to get a hold of Jamie online, it's Twitter. His Twitter account is, I believe, either Monad. Or just search for Jamie Corkhill. I'll have the links in the show notes. Jamie, of course, is going to send me some of the links to what he's mentioned in terms of the frameworks, and we'll post those in. But again, any last words about how people can get a hold of you, how they can help with certain projects? Anything you'd like to say?
Um, oh no, I think just on Twitter is probably where I'll be most responsive. Also, email. I'm one of those people who is quite fond of email as opposed to texting. But yeah, you can see my email on GitHub if anyone wants to communicate. And I always try to make it as clear as possible through Twitter that, if anyone has questions or if I can help anyone in any manner whatsoever, then to just let me know and I'll try to make time.
Well, that's wonderful. Jamie, thank you. As always, I look forward to more back and forth with you in all the threads that you post. I think they're incredibly helpful. So definitely look for Jamie Corkhill on Twitter, and lots more to come this year and the coming years. So I'm excited to see where you go from here, and the many different projects that are on the move, and all the success to you in those.
Thank you. And thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks a lot.